In our top story this hour, Old Mutual Chief Executive Officer Peter Moyo has won another round in his battle with the insurance giant.
Moyo has been allowed to admit his second dismissal letter as evidence in the contempt of court application. Moyo approached the South Gauteng High Court saying that the entire board must be held in contempt for preventing him from returning to work.
Old Mutual fired Moyo in June after having suspended him over an alleged conflict of interest. The decision was later ruled to be unlawful, with the court ordering the insurance giant to temporarily reinstate him. Old Mutual now has 10 days to explain why Moyo's second letter of termination is not in contempt of court. All right, and Peter is seated now with all parties involved in this matter.
Palisa, thanks very much indeed. As you said, let's explore this now with Old Mutual's CEO, Peter Moyo, and his lawyer, Mr. Eric Mabuza. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Moyo, must I still call you CEO of Old Mutual? What's the story?
Well, it depends on whether you respect the judgments of our courts. If you respect the judgments of our courts, I'm the CEO of Old Mutual.
All right. So, Mr. Mabuza, we watched the court proceedings today, and we're not lawyers, so some of it was quite hard to follow. In layman's terms, what happened today?
Well, in layman's terms, the first thing that is important is that this is the third time that Old Mutual has been told that they were wrong in preventing Mr. Moyo from taking over his duties as CEO. That is the first important thing. The second important thing is that the court agreed with us that the second termination, the so-called second termination, cannot be separated from the first termination of June, which Old Mutual tried to say there were two separate acts, but the court disagreed and said those two letters must be read together because the second termination also refers to the June letter. The third most important thing is that the judge agreed with us that the directors of Old Mutual are before court, they are joined in the proceedings, and they face possible imprisonment. And the reasons that the judge gave for joining the directors of Old Mutual is that you cannot imprison a company because it's a legal persona. If you come to a decision to imprison, it must be individuals who can be imprisoned. So that is very, very important. And the directors of Old Mutual have been given an opportunity to show cause, to give an explanation why the second letter of termination is not in contempt of court. They have been given 10 days to explain their behavior.
All right, so what's the significance of joining the two letters putting the two letters together?
Because we were still awaiting the court decision when Old Mutual sent the second letter, even before they reinstated Mr. Moyo. So they tried to say that was a new termination, and the court said, no, you can't see that as a second termination because it refers to the first termination of June. And it was even before the court had delivered its judgment. So it was blatant undermining of court proceedings in doing that.
Mr. Moyo, how did we get to this point that a CEO is fighting with its board, or the board fighting with its CEO, depending on which way you look at it? How did we get to this point?
It will sound like it's tongue-in-cheek. I was actually busy minding my own business, running the company, when from one day I heard these proceedings. Maybe just to go back to what they said. At the time they said they got to the conclusion that they'd lost confidence and trust in me because of the so-called NMT matters. We went to court, so they suspended me and then issued with a termination letter. We went to court and said that termination was unlawful. The court agreed with us because they had not followed process. We even went further and said, actually, other than them not following my contract, the substance of what they were talking about, the so-called NMT issues, were not the real issues. So what were some of the issues? It was that NMT paid, I am a shareholder of NMT. All Mutual is a shareholder at NMT, and All Mutual, in addition, a preference shareholder. They said the preference capital was meant to be redeemed on the 30th of June 2018, and the dividend was paid on the 3rd or 4th of, or declared on the 3rd or 4th of July. Firstly, the contract does not say you cannot pay a dividend, you must redeem first. It actually doesn't. So it's not even an issue in the contract. They've made a big issue that when a dividend of 105 million was declared, I got my share. All Mutual got its share. But it's also important to note that even at that meeting, the preference dividend was paid. I'm not involved in the administrative issues. 3, All Mutual always had a director whose duties were always clear in my employment contract. That director voted in exactly the same way that I voted. Clearly, decisions had actually been made long before they even spoke to me. They already had some lawyers' letters which they said were privileged, which I was not even able to see that they'd been working together with Bom and Gilfillan. So really, it's actually surprising, actually, how we got to this point.
So,
sorry, by the way, there's another very interesting thing. They go on and say, at the time, NMT Capital paid these dividends. NMT was insolvent. That's actually not true. I don't even know how the board can even come to that conclusion. I actually showed one of the directors on the 23rd of May, a guy called John Lister, that you are not looking at the correct information. In fact, one of the directors actually made an assumption. So he told me that he believed that there was a contractual requirement to redeem before paying a dividend, which is not true. So you can actually see that either somebody was giving them false information, or they never read the documents, or both actually.
But at some point, you as his lawyer and the Old Mutual's lawyers could sit down, look at the facts, and just come to some kind of agreement, because the facts are the facts, right?
That's correct. But Peter, contempt, it's a very, very serious issue. You'll remember that first time Mr. Moyo went back to work on the 31st, they prevented him from taking his position. The second time, they sent a second letter of termination. The third time, they again prevented him from taking over his position. The fourth time is when Mr. Manuel insulted the judge. So it's a very, very serious act. It's not an exaggeration to say that the directors of Old Mutual are one step closer to imprisonment. But we don't want to go there. We want to give them another opportunity to mitigate their contempt and allow Mr. Moyo to go back to work on Wednesday, the coming Wednesday. That in a way will mitigate any further contempt. But if they continue to disallow him, it will further aggravate the contempt.
Peter, I know you directed this at Eric. In fact, I think the first ever interview that we had, Eric was actually very specific that this is something that could have been dealt with over a cup of coffee. I think those were your words. We actually wrote, and that was in our court papers, that we were willing to talk about this, because actually All Mutual today is suffering. All Mutual has got 32,000 people that are very innocent. They cannot be allowed to go through this.
Does there come a time where you say, I may be right, I may be correct, but for the good of the company that I love, I will step aside and perhaps let's negotiate a settlement?
Sorry, we actually did that, Peter. It is in our court papers. We wrote to them. In fact, day one of the court hearings, Honorable Judge Mashile gave both parties the opportunity to settle. In fact, he stopped the proceedings, said, go and talk about it. We're willing to talk about it. All Mutual were not willing to talk about it. We wrote them a letter suggesting that there can be a different way. Let's actually do that. And it was not, it was after we had actually won the first case. We actually said, let's be the bigger party here and actually stop this. But they wouldn't. You would actually have heard what the chairman of Old Mutual said. I mean, he said they're going to run me dry. So it's actually, he actually made.
Is this a personal thing?
Well, it was never personal. It actually was never personal for me. All I was saying was that I was busy minding my business, doing my own job, which the board itself said I'd done very well. Then this thing came about, and the only way, because I was never really given an opportunity even to have any meaningful discussions with them. They came to me and said, lost confidence, and they actually said, accept mutual separation. I said, I can't accept mutual separation. They said, resign. I said, I can't. I said, however, I know that if people can't work together, they've got to separate. I said, go and find a way of doing this. Then they came with a suspension letter, and then it was one way.
All right, so they refused to talk initially, but you've been to court, documents have been put on the table, evidence has been put on the table. Are they still adamant that your client breached trust and is worthy of being fined?
But Peter, the Old Mutual directors must just swallow their pride and implement the court judgment, or if they want to talk, they must talk.
Come to you.
Come and talk to us. I mean, the court, for the third time, the court has vindicated Mr. Moyo. So there's no reason why they must be allowed to break the law and play.
Are they not appealing what this court has decided? Is that not the process that they're taking?
Quite true. They're appealing, but the court said whilst they're appealing, Mr. Moyo must be returned to his position. So that is very clear. There's nothing difficult about that court judgment. At first they said they did not understand the court judgment. We went back to court and clarified it. We've clarified that for the second time. 3 times now the court has told them that Mr. Moyo ought to be at work. How many more times should the court pronounce on the same issue? It's just not right, particularly for the respect for law. I mean, for Mr. Manuel to go on national television and to insult a judge in our judiciary like that is simply unacceptable.
All right, perhaps in trying to close this up, you said you were busy minding your own business. So did it take you by surprise? Was there any kind of indication that the board was starting to change its view of you in the lead up to this?
Actually not. In fact, the letter that I wrote to the board, when I first found out, I said, I'm actually surprised that we've even come to this conclusion without ever even talking to me. At that stage, they'd never spoken to me. So honestly, it was actually, it came from your proverbial left field.
And Pinky Mahud is now left. Is that an indication that perhaps this board isn't as unanimous as they're stating?
I can leave it to my lawyer, but on the other hand, my simple view, my own simple view, and it's actually based on my own analysis. It actually suggests that there is trouble somewhere, because a board member resigns 2 days after a board meeting where she's actually been present. You've been a board member for 7 years. You don't wake up in the morning straight after a board meeting and say, I'm leaving.
Peter, it's a very, very sad story for Old Mutual to be reduced to these levels where the center does not seem to be holding. There's just chaos and there's confusion all over.
Have any of the directors tried to reach out behind the scenes to you, Mr. Moyo, or to you, Mr. Mabuza?
I can't disclose that in case they don't want
may or may not.
Yeah, they don't want that to be known, but I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, look, in fairness, there might have been some people that have actually approached at different parties to say, find a way, but but as Mr. Mabuza says.
Have any of the major shareholders come to you?
Oh, I have actually spoken to some of the major shareholders, and I've got, if they can speak for themselves, I'm not going to speak for them.
All right, gentlemen, thanks very much indeed for coming through. I have a feeling we'll be chatting again in the near future.
Hopefully not.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, fellas.